Future Talk, Green Economic Opportunities Amidst a Rise in Industrial Policies, please welcome to the stage Martin Knobbe from Handelsblatt.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the panel Green Economic Opportunities Amidst a Rise in Industrial Policies. Well, no doubt, financially, we are living in difficult times. The global inflation rate is still high. We are facing several wars and most recently a big trade conflict with the United States. And the tendency to shrinking development budget seems to be becoming a global trend. It is a difficult, or let's say a critical phase of the global economy, especially for emerging market and developing economies. And therefore, it is still unclear whether traditional approaches for economic development remain powerful or if we have to develop totally new strategies. I think we will find it out on that panel. But let's keep optimistic, especially on that panel. Green economy and its regulation may provide an opportunity for emerging market and developing economies to catch up. And if we keep looking and searching, we see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. Just one of many examples. The global energy transition will require the world to ramp up mineral and metal production on an unseen scale. And if we do it smartly and not in an exploitative way, there is a chance that many countries can get some profit and wealth out of it. So our main two questions we have to discuss today are: how do industrial policies and sustainability regulations in advanced economies influence these opportunities for emerging market and developing economies? And how can these EMDEs most effectively leverage these opportunities, for example, by policies, partnerships, etc.? And I'm more than delighted to discuss these questions with my smart guests here on the panel. First, Madam Secretary Maropene Ramokgopa, I hope I pronounced it correctly, from South Africa, is the minister in the presidency responsible for planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us here. Thank you. Jörg Eigendorf, Chief Sustainability Officer with the Deutsche Bank. I think many people know him here in the room. And he's a former colleague, but now you work on the other side. And we have Christian Ketels, Global Lead for Value Chains with the World Bank, which has organized this panel together with the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany. Thank you so much. So let's dive right away into it. Madam Secretary, what industrial policy conditions in advanced economies are helping the green transition? What effects have you seen so far? And maybe even more important, where are the obstacles?
Thank you very much. And we're really excited to be here, of course, as South Africa. And from where I come from and where I operate, of course, we do believe that everything must be legislated, of course. And the good thing that we're seeing is that there are a lot of policies and legislations that have been put in place. For example, in South Africa, last year, the president did enact into law the Climate Change Act that is actually responsible for ensuring that we do have mitigation and adaptation actions that would constitute what we would do in terms of the global climate change issues. And of course, and I was just sharing with you guys that in terms of what would make climate change actually become successful, not climate change adaptation actions and mitigation to be actually successful. It's not only what we can do in terms of policy, but it will also have to do with us industrializing, but also coming up with the technology that we would need, but not only technology, access to that particular technology. Of course, in South Africa, we do have minerals that are going to be critical in ensuring that the technology that is put in place actually becomes successful And we just started discussing and coming up with a strategy of our critical minerals. We do know that in many other countries, critical minerals policy is already there, but we believed that from ourselves as the leading country in Africa, we needed to come with our own policy and operation so that we can be able to guide other African countries. So we are already having a strategy that we have put in place that we do believe by the end of this year, we'll be having a policy and a legislation that would guide us in terms of these critical minerals. Of course, we want to move away from how Africa has always done what it did in terms of minerals. So in terms of beneficiation of those particular minerals, we would like to be able to do all that in Africa, and would like to ensure that the skill base that is needed in terms of the transition to this climate change and the transition, what we call the just energy transition, actually takes everyone with. So that's where we are right now.
If you can give us a small insight about the discussion within your country. When we talk about legislation, what kind of arguments are there on the floor, and what are you debating about?
Okay, first of all, it should be transformational. Transformation is quite important in my country, but also we are also talking about the private sector participation. That legislation should be able to speak to private sector participation, which hasn't really been so huge. So those are some of the things that we're talking about, and we're actually discussing. The tax base as well. How are we going to deal with the tax base that needs to align with what we're trying to build, but globally as well, what needs to we actually have to align with. So in the main, that's what we are actually trying to address. But most of all, as I've already said, we don't want to leave anyone behind. As you know, we do have cities and towns that had been built because of the coal mining. Therefore, how do we take everyone in those areas as well with us as we move into this just transition, or the energy transition, green energy transition that is actually in place now?
So there was the internal discussion. What are your expectations towards the international community? What is your biggest request to us here?
The biggest request, of course, is the fact that we need investment in technology, the hardware technology, but we also need investment in our human capital. Because as I've already said, that is mostly important, because if we don't deal with the human capital, we will leave others behind. We know that we are going to need engineers in the green energy and technicians. So we definitely need those kind of partnerships to allow us to be able to prepare our people to be able to move with us as we move into this. But we are so much committed into reducing the greenhouse gas, and we will also make sure that whatever it is that we do, we take Africa with us.
So I think, Jörg, it's your point now, because we discussed already about the private investors. And what do you think? How can private investors be becoming more involved in that in all that business? And maybe you can give us a short overview how the situation is like in countries like South Africa for private investors.
Obviously, our private participation legislation is not as strong as it should be. However, it is developing. For example, our energy, or Eskom, I think everybody knows about Eskom, which is our energy regulator and energy generation and transmission distribution, in what actually regulate energy and give us energy in South Africa, electricity. We have started now in opening up, for example, private sector to actually come on board. We have started ensuring that we have put a policy in place where private sector has actually invested a lot and it participating in generation of green energy in particular. Yeah. As a result, of course, that particular landscape that we have been able to develop in terms of policies, exactly what we will be using for private sector participation. We will obviously have systems that we put in place to ensure that we do exempt some of these private sectors that are actually investing in South Africa, most especially in green energy, on the taxes that are in place. However, we still have a responsibility to actually get revenue for our own country, of course.
So I ask Jörg from Deutsche Bank, does the private sector is on board or is coming on board, or if not, why not?
We are on board. We are already on board. We are doing financing in sub-Saharan Africa. a lot, and we've just recently $500 million program in Benin. We financing hospital in Côte d'Ivoire. So we have a lot of these financings, but it's just not enough. And we need to ask ourselves, why is it not enough? The first is capital costs are much too high. And for two reasons. The one, we talk about energy transition. And if you look at the projects in energy transition, they are usually already, even if you do them in Germany or the US or in Japan or in one of the OECD countries, or in South Africa, which is one of the stable countries in Africa, you have always a problem that these projects are high risk, that they usually need a huge risk premium if you want to get investors on board. And then you even want to do it in the developing world and in emerging economies. So now we have to look at, and I usually look at it from a risk lens. Yeah. So it's not the easy approach that you just say, okay, what can we do as private investors? How do we get capital costs down? And then you can look at every single player. We have the government here. We have a multinational international development bank here. A private bank who's missing. The fourth one is a private investor. But then you have the whole value chain. Now you can ask, first you have high political risk when you go to a lot of developing countries.
Can you define what is the risk? Is it the political
you have the political risk, you have the project risk, you have the currency hedge risk, and you always have the forex risk in there. And you need to think then in each, and then eventually you have an investor who wants to have a risk return, which is high enough, and he wants a standardized product, and he wants to get investors, when they get in, they also want to get out, so they need liquidity. So if you have these very small projects, one of the problems is a lot of these projects are tailor-made. They're not scalable. You can't go from one country to the next, and then it's always restarted again. You have a lot of governments where you say the rule of law, political issues, instability. I lived in Russia in the 90s for 6 years, so I really know what political instability means and how it deters investors. Then you get to the project risk. You really have to ask yourself, okay, if it's hydrogen, the scale of this project, the years you need, how you get these things investable, who can take the risk? You always have to analyze, is it a multinational development bank? Is it a private bank? I can tell you, Deutsche Bank, like all the other banks, we are highly regulated. Our capital costs are pretty high. And usually we can't even take it on our balance sheet. We can take parts of it on our balance sheet, but we need to find the investor base. So we really need to think, how do we get a product which is liquid enough that we then can sell to investors, to insurance companies. And there you talk about triple B and better. And how do you get to the triple B from very few countries of the 55 countries or 53 countries, I think, in Africa. 54, sorry, I'm almost right. Yeah. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. But 50 of them are sub-investment grade. So you really need to think, how do we get the risk out of it eventually? But it's possible, and therefore we need to work together, and we need to make of the international development banks, the money leverageable. And right now the ratio, I think it's some 50-50. This is not the ratio we could live with. We would have to have a 50-500 ratio in order to get to the trillions we need to fulfill our goals with regards to the SDGs.
Before we get to you, Christian, one last question to you, Jörg. So are you working on a kind of de-risking strategy, or what would you need to tell your investors that the risk is minimized or less than before?
You need always, the simple thing is, who takes the first loss tranche, for example? Who is taking the risk so you get in the triple B range? And often you even get in the A range and therefore it needs an international development bank. Therefore it needs a government guarantee. And this money needs to be deployed very effectively, efficiently. And this is not happening yet. Often you also look at the regulation, for example, and the title of our session here is, how does our regulation influence, what are the side effects of our regulation? I mean, private banks are very limited in deploying their capital to these things. So we could look at the regulation. We could also look always what kind of investors do we want to target? There's a whole investor universe out there. As long as you are not in the investable space, you exclude many of them out there. So you need to think about what do they have in their rules for investment, and how can we create that product? And we can, but we need to make it scalable. We need to make it easier. We need to collaborate better with the international development banks, and then it is possible. We have proven it so many times that it is possible, but it's always a cumbersome effort.
Christian, how can you help private investors in private banks?
First of all, I would say that this exactly describes how the role of the World Bank has changed. When the institution was founded, we were in a different world, right? I mean, countries even like South Africa didn't have that type of access to the capital markets. Many of the countries in which we are active are not only working with us for the money, they are also working with us for the money, but largely because that is unlocking private sector capital. And this is really what now is one of our key goals. This is how we measure our success. It's not just by how we are lending to countries, but how we are mobilizing private sector capital to make the huge investments that are necessary. To give you one example, we're talking about critical minerals. So the World Bank earlier this year has published an energy transition roadmap for Zambia. Now that roadmap outlines investment needs of $60 billion for infrastructure, for skills, for energy, for a lot of things that need to be happening. We know that 90% of that investment has to come from the private sector. So we need to think about what the bank can do. Now we can, and the minister talked about skill development. We have a lot of experience, and we're working very closely with our South African colleagues and others on skills, on regulations, on investment climate, on infrastructure. But I think what we also understand more and more is we need to understand better the market in which we are operating and exactly the type of risks that are currently holding back private sector investments. There is a big conundrum in this industry if we're talking about the energy transition and critical minerals. So if you look at the projections of the International Energy Associations, they're telling us that by 2030, which is not that far out, we need 300 new mines, 60 mines for copper, 50 for lithium, to meet the demand that they are, hopefully, that will fuel sort of the transition that we're happening. So what you would expect is that there is this huge market, massive capital flowing in. Actually, that's not happening. And why is it not happening? In lithium, for example, you've seen that the price spiked and now dramatically went down. So there is no short-term profitability in these markets because a lithium mine takes 20 years to develop. So you're having these sort of very long cycles. We're not in a market where companies very quickly can react and say, oh, here's a profitable opportunity, I build up capacity. We need to think much more long-term. And I think that means for us and our colleagues in the multilateral development banks that we need to think much more about risk sharing, about guarantees, and how we can work also with our global partners in ensuring that there is a market that enables investment. And the G7 has started the RISE initiative 3 years ago under the Japanese presidency, then continued by the Italians and now the Canadians, where the focus is exactly that. How can we use the capital of the G7 countries who is interested in having affordable and secure and diversified access of these minerals, but in a way that actually benefits African and other countries? Because we understand that this will only happen if we do mining differently, if we do it sustainably, if we do it in a way that enables economic development in your kind of countries. And South Africa now with the G20 presidency, I mean, you've taken a lot of steps to say, how can we do this? What is necessary to put in place? So I think there is a lot of stuff moving on, but we have to understand that it is a difficult industry. And the market structures are far from open and competitive. And that, I think, is a new area in which we all need to adjust.
And we have to say we are too complex. Everything that is done, regulation, I mean, just look at the CSRD in Europe and CS3D and everything, taxonomy. We love to do the things very complex. And that makes it so difficult. And if we always try to export then the complex standard, it is also going to be super difficult. I think what it really needs are simple solutions. You can always see when you have a product, that's because it creates liquidity. If you have this small fragmented market, it doesn't help. You need to have big products, investable products where where you can have an investor base in a large scale and make it simple as possible, and the perfect is the enemy of the good.
What I would say is that regional integration becomes key in that if you want to scale whatever projects that are there. I know, for example, in South Africa, Eskom that I was talking about used to actually sell and give electricity to the whole region, SADC region, including some part of the East African countries. So what we need to talk
by the World
about.
Bank as well, right? So
Yes.
give
So
electric energy to the people.
that is exactly what I'm talking about. If you want to scale, let us talk about regional integration. And in Africa, for example, there's the African Free Trade Area that we have just developed. It is in place, it is functional. As a result, it just means that if you want to scale up, regional integration is what we are all about now in Africa. So Africa is a better place to actually come now. It's very opportune because of that.
And I would say South Africa is particularly strategic. You know, we work a lot of countries in Africa that have minerals and that are going to be critical for the energy transition. They have hopes that they ultimately will also build batteries and so on. And it's not obvious that that's going to happen because the economics of that are difficult. You need scale, you need access to markets, you need a lot of skills, as you mentioned, in manufacturing. South Africa has both the minerals and the experience in mining, but also the manufacturing base. And so I think we need to create these regional systems in order to make sure that those of your neighbors that have the mineral assets but not the manufacturing capability are still part of that entity. That's not going to be easy, but I think it's absolutely critical if we want to make that transition happen.
Madam Secretary, the decisive factor will be whether these revenues out of, for example, critical minerals are used for South Africa's own development and not just to enrich a few others as we had it in the past. So how can you secure that the money and the value chain will be in your own country and not anywhere outside?
Well, I do not remember. Maybe you can remind me in terms of what would the money be used for, if not for development of our own country. Not only our country, as I've already said, the region itself. That's what we have always done. So if you would come to, maybe, I know many people have wanted to talk about the triple BEE or the BEE, which is more about transformation more than anything else. Of course, we do have alternatives where, of course, whatever it is, that investment that is coming, and because we are operating under a legislative environment, it is not just like if you just come and I've decided because I'm Minister Maropene that no, you can get this and everything else, we can do it elsewhere. Everything else is done under a legislative environment. As a result, you can then now be able to know exactly whatever investment that you are bringing, where will it be going to. It is more than anything else for transformation, but most of all for development. It is for this reason that you can then now be able to say, you can have a mix. I will do this in terms of transformation. However, I can also do this in terms of development, build schools, build clinics, and be able to invest in more other things that can be able to change the lives of the people. Because as I've already said, we are a very regulated under the issue of ensuring that judiciary becomes part of what we use to be able to deal with the issues that we deal with, even in business. South Africa becomes better because of that, because we don't operate under anything else outside of the legislation that we already have. So we are a rule-based country. That one is something that we actually pride ourselves with. You can do your own check. You would actually find that whatever it is that we are doing would not go to anything else except for the development of our own country, including transformation. But development in terms of reskilling people, which will be broad-based, of course, is something that you can be able to bring, most especially when you talk about green energy. Because at the moment, we don't have the technical know-how. So it means that the investment needs to talk about what we do to take everyone with us, including the skilling, most especially in our training and vocational education, precisely because that's where we need to produce technicians, that's where we need to produce engineering. So that will be the landscape of investment that you would be able to invest in if you come to South Africa.
Christian, that countries are able to not only export raw materials, but also process them and maybe use it in production. what needs do they have, and what help can they get from, for example, the World Bank?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, there are the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns. This is a known question, right? I mean, I think we have the challenge of how do you develop the mining sector for benefits of an economy for a long time. One benefit is, of course, the resources that are coming in. The fiscal resources, as the minister said, that you can use for development more broadly. So this is one. The second one, there is actually other economic activity around mining. The most important one that directly comes is the processing, which by now actually is very much dominated by one country. And so I think there are clear investment opportunities. It's still very capital intensive. So this is not going to create all that amount of jobs. Where you have opportunities, and other countries, for example, Chile have shown that, is there is a supplier industry and a service sector around mining where there are actually much more jobs, and you can build that up over time. I mentioned Zambia before. Zambia and Chile had the same level of copper production in the 70s. Now Chile's copper production is 10 times as high, and the benefits to the Chilean economy is much more widespread because they were able to build these these ecosystems. So I think there is another opportunity. But there's a third one, and I think, Minister, you pointed in that direction. To do mining in a different and more sustainable way, you need to change institutions, you need to change structures, you need to change the way that you do business. You also need electricity and infrastructure. But this is the foundation of many other sectors. And I think we need to much more systematically think about how we leverage the investments that are being made to create access for the metals and the mining products, to also develop other types of industries that might not be directly related to mining in terms of input-output relationships, but they use the same skills, the same infrastructure, and the same institutional things. I mean, you know, there is no magic. We know this is how development works. But we too often, I think, have focused only on sort of the management of the fiscal resources that came in, rather than to say, no, how do we use this actually as a step, as a lever, to improve and modernize our economies in order to then also broaden diversify the economic structure.
But I think South Africa is a good example how it can work, right? You see other countries where it doesn't work.
Absolutely, and there's, you know, I mean, there's a broad set of tools. You know, you also asked about the bank. You know, that we of course finance. You know, from providing technical assistance to, you know, the huge energy project that we're doing in Africa on electrification. There's regional efforts on infrastructure that are built, skill development, and so on. So I think there's actually a very well tried and tested toolkit of instruments that we need, but we need the strategic direction. It's not just the individual project here and there. We need to make sure that this becomes a puzzle where things actually work together, because none of this is a quick fix. We're talking about 10, 15 years of development to transform an economy.
And that's a question, I mean, Jörg, how can you convince investors if you tell them you get your revenues in 20 years?
Look, when we look at the title again of our session, it's industrial policy. And if you then compare worldwide who has done the best industrial policy over the last 20, 30 years with regards to energy transition, then unfortunately I have to say it's rather China than any other country. So we are in a situation right now, and this is exactly what Christian just said. We have to look forward. We need industrial policy here. We need an industrial strategy. This is, by the way, for countries like South Africa and many other African and countries in Southeast Asia, a huge opportunity. We think back a little bit. We are coming from a world where raw materials seem to be infinite. I mean, we are still acting as if this world has no shortage in supply. It's just a price matter. We see it. There will be oil forever. There will be gas forever. There will be copper forever, lithium forever. We act as if this is the case. It's just not true. So we will change. And we had a fascinating discussion yesterday at a dinner table where we started with security policy, and somebody said, oh, we need a foreign climate policy. And I said, and then we need a domestic climate policy. Not only that, we need a raw material policy, because a lot of the things we are seeing will be about shortages in the supply chain. Our supply chain thinking has fundamentally changed since COVID. And we are now in the situation that we all the companies not only think in just in time and making it as efficient as possible, they are thinking about what is my alternative? Can my supply chain break down? And I have to tell you, we as banks are at the beginning of looking at nature services, where in the supply chain of our clients or those we lend money to, where are there risks which may be difficult to tackle? So this is a huge opportunity for developing countries, for countries in the global south, because and the Chinese have done it right. They have very strategically in the 90s decided we need to go for e-vehicles because we will never be able to provide our country with an infrastructure, with transport in the way the other countries have done it. They have favored fossil fuel. If you look, for example, China right now is investing more than 4% of its GDP annually in the energy transition. Europe, 2%, America, less than 2%. Now, if we think about this number, it is just shows all of us that they will have a huge competitive advantage. And in this supply chain, we have to catch up to that. And if we want to catch up with that, we definitely need these partners. We need countries we can rely on. We need to build these supply chains, and we don't need to build them for the next 5 years, as we heard. It's a return in 20 years, and we will need a lot of strategic thinking. And by the way, our democratic cycle thinks 4 years is long term. In China, they think 40 years is long term.
Where's the right place for that strategic thinking? Is it the G7? Is it the G20? Is it? Do we have to start locally? Where
each country has to start by itself and then coordinate. Right now, we see worldwide a disintegration, which is crazy in times where we need each other more than ever, because material, the substance of this planet is decreasing rapidly. The supply chains are breaking down. We really need to work together closely. So each country is well advised to start with its own industrial policy. Think, where's my strengths? How can I develop my youth so I can, and if you think about mining capacity, you have to do it years in advance. You have to train your people. You need to think about where you want to be. And then you need to come together because you will need the others. And if the thinking in many democratic countries right now also, and not only in democratic countries, in autocracies, is we want to be as independent of everybody else as possible. That won't work. If you go down that road, you will just be done in a couple of years because your supply chains will break down for sure.
Of course, there's no one who can do it alone. From my experience is that, of course, each country has to have a political will first. But when you make strategic decisions on a regional level or on a multilateral level, then you go and domesticate it into your own country. It works better. I see with ourselves, when we started with the AfCFTA, for example, we took that decision based on, of course, EU. We saw how EU is actually working, and the integration has actually strengthened most of the member states of EU. At the AU level, we took that decision. Then we now came with a regional, sub-regional economic communities. Then we went to the country. But we made sure that there is capacity to support countries to be able to actually adapt to whatever it is that we have put in place. And of course, discussions and negotiations will take time because each country has got their own interest. However, when we know that the strategic vision that we have put in place actually is taking us to be able to work together, and there is benefit, but there's also places where we can actually compare ourselves if we are moving or not, that actually works. So in my view, yes, that's why I will always talk about regional integration. If we do that, we're able to deal with the eliminations of tariffs and other barriers, of course, of trade, but most of all of ensuring that whatever it is that we'll be doing and taking out of a region would be done in a scalable way. But it would make sense also for the private sector, but also speak to our own needs.
But
Christian,
yeah, let me maybe say something controversial, or
very welcome.
Something
finally
hopefully get us to where I think we have to do some soul searching. Because of course I fully agree. We're in a world where the need for collaboration is larger than ever. Because we have so many global challenges that no country alone can address. But Minister, you started in your first panel yesterday with the question of trust.
Of course.
I think we have to ask ourselves, why in this time, where there's so much need for multilateralism and collaboration, the political trust of many of our societies in our system providing those type of solutions is so low.
That's a big question.
And it will not be, we can't answer that just by saying, no, but we need to do more. Yes, we need to do more, but I think we also have to ask ourselves what we can do differently. And you talked a little bit about the European regulations, for example, that affect international trade, which I think are all very well meant in terms of sustainability. But it's actually not more a question of ideological goal or objective, but how we do it. And so I think this focus of how do we actually get it done? How do we do a supply chain regulation that ensures sustainability without closing the market for our African colleagues that say, but we would like to sell our products to this market. So moving it away a little bit from the ideological question, what is really the goal and the objective, and much more to the practical.
But Christian, I think, to be a little bit more controversial, I think, I heard that, I remember in Russia, for example, in the 90s, I always heard we have to find our own way. Finding the own way in Russia, we know where it led to. I mean, the thing is, there are so many proven concepts. We know what a good rule of law means.
Yes.
We know, and you talked about trust. Investors hate uncertainty. You want to know what you deal with. You want to go to an insurance company and tell them, oh, you may get that, you may get your coupon, you may not get it. Let's see. Right. They are out. They don't do this. They can't do this. So there are a lot of concepts which are proven. What I think we need to change is our thinking, and I think this is the most material question, because environmental and climate policy, to me, is a security issue. It is a resource issue. It's in the center of many, many things, because for the last 200 years, we have never internalized the externalities of doing business. And we have not priced raw materials accurately. This is going to be a fundamental change. By the way, I think you studied economics. I did. You learned that, and you didn't, but you learned it probably already in school.
Yes,
that you need to price in the externalities. This is market failure. If you have market failure, you need governments to step in. Governments didn't step in. And you see how troublesome it is when you look at a right carbon price. How do you get to the carbon price sets the right incentives? And there's a final thing. Every investor wants to have a reliable system. And the problem is what we are doing, even in Germany. I mean, we have been excellent in really terrifying the people about e-vehicles and heat pumps. I mean, these are the two market-ready things you need to deploy. And what have we achieved in Germany? We stagnate right now. It's completely nonsense, and we are all sure in 15 years or not 10 years, most of the people in Germany will drive an e-vehicle. That's absolutely clear. But the stop and go, then you support it, then you stop supporting it. Then you have a huge heat pump discussion, then you don't want heat pumps anymore. Then you have a heat pump, everybody wants to buy them, then nobody wants to buy them. Then even heat pump companies go bankrupt. All I want to say is, it's even on a national level where you think you have stability, we get it wrong. And if we get it so wrong, we need to think about it. And it's not a miracle. I think we need to understand, in a world where we always try to maximize the political position I have right now, and this is a danger for the democracies especially. If you maximize the political position every moment, you will never get to industrial policy where anybody relies on, and consumers and corporates will take decisions. Because what you see right now, look at what happened, by the way, have one more example. We usually have 20 billion plus in sustainable financing and ESG investments a quarter. 20 billion. In the first quarter, we had 16 billion. When I heard the number first, and I didn't have the details, I thought this is the US. What happened? No, the US was stable. Germany. 4 billion were lacking in Germany because the uncertainty because of omnibus, CSRD, and all these discussions, that made the market break down. And then the MiFID regulation for private investors also doesn't help. So that market broke down in Germany. Investors hate insecurity, uncertainty, and this is what we need to solve.
So what are you asking for? For more political leadership? For more regulation? Or less regulation?
I ask for prudent, principle-based regulation. Don't try to regulate everything in detail. Then you end up like with the EU taxonomy. You're so detailed that you you are done with 40% and you don't get it finished. I mean, this is what you need to be very principle-based, easy. I don't need to report on 150 or 350 KPIs. These are not KPIs under this ESRS. These are not PIs, these are Is. And then I have to make PIs and KPIs again out of it. And that is, to be honest, this is a waste of time. We are wasting our time for things that don't help. We need to focus on these things. And this is why I'm always get very hesitant when I hear we need to find new ways. A lot of the things are out there. Good regulation is simple and comparable. Let's start with 10 indicators in Europe and get it right. Then we can have 15, 20, 50, and 100.
For me, I think stability will be brought by good and strong institutions. Because if you've got good and strong institutions,
Absolutely.
They are sustainable. I also am one of the people that do not really believe in trying new things, but I only believe in let's improve what we have or let's review it so that we can then now be able to agree. But clearly, there is a need to actually look at the state, government, private sector working together for a greater good. In our country, we are actually believing we've got 3 priorities for the next coming 5 years. And one of it is to build a capable state. And we said that if you build a capable state, you need a space where you bring private sector, not only on implementation, but also on strategy. And we have been doing that.
Super important. By the way, I'm now asked when I'm somewhere in the capitals, I'm asked, what does it mean when this is operationalized? And I think this is the right question. The regulation often does not take this into account. You really need the politicians, the regulators need to think deeply about what does it mean if we operationalize it. If we cannot operationalize it, it's great to have it there in theory, but it won't work in practice. It's comparably easy to operationalize CO2 and integrate it in the management board compensation. To operationalize nature, terribly difficult. I think it will be about nature services and the risk attached to it. But so we need to think about the simple things. Perfect is the enemy of the good. And often I can only say, if we in Germany followed Ludwig Erhard and his principles, we would get it right. This man is dead for more than 50 years. Yeah? So we would get so many things right. And the one thing that is needed now, and this is a little bit difficult in this volatility of the political landscape, and I know that you're fighting with the same, is to get an industrial policy is a pure contradiction to making voters happy tomorrow.
Yeah. I mean, you can still find Ludwig Erhard in the ministry, actually, so maybe this helps as a statue, right? Minister, I'm curious about, we talked about the backlash of, for example, on the electric car market, that especially Germans are not so enthusiastic as they have been.
I love it.
Years ago. But how does this uncertainty affect your strategy, for example, in battery production and your planning? So how is the interaction between our markets and your production?
Look, I do believe, in my view, and this is what we are actually working towards. Once we put systems in place, law, including institutions that would be able to make it necessary for us to adapt to green energy and EVs, we will all follow. That's one thing that I've learned. And I will give you an example. This has got nothing to do, of course, with EVs, but this is what we have learned. When we came up with the Government of National Unity of South Africa, I'm from the African National Congress. One of our biggest partners is actually Democratic Alliance, who have been our competitor for quite a very long time. Ideologically, we don't agree almost on anything. We only agreed on one thing: how do we take South Africa forward? So I do believe that if there is a decision, and you spoke about that, a decision and leadership to say that we're doing away with certain things, people will follow. For a very long time, I really do believe, I will give you a very pedestrian example. When cellular phones were actually being introduced, I will speak about my country, people were thinking, no, we can't do this. There is radiation, there's this and that. But once we moved away from utilizing the normal telephones people then adapted. We just have to take that decision. make sure that we put systems in place, legislation in place that would then now open up more for the EVs, for example. We will then now see that there will be change because those other available cars will no longer be there. Therefore, people will then now see the need for them to be able to adapt to the new things that are in place. That's what I think. That's my belief.
So 30 seconds left. So my last question and the wish for short answers. Sorry, Jörg, but I talk about the new way we have to, to go. When you think about it, what is the biggest and most important change in your institution or government? What you have to do to find that kind of new strategy? Christian.
So for me, it's really that we need to see the sustainability transition and economic growth as an integral part that has to work together. Either we are going to succeed on both sides, or we're not going to succeed. And I think, we're both economists, we are trained to think in trade-offs. So we ultimately very easily say, okay, if you do more from green transition, you have to take money away from other things. But actually in South Africa and many other developing countries in which we work, that's not the situation. These countries need to change. So anyway, for both, and now we need to make sure that this change, leveraging the opportunities of the green technology, is also creating jobs and prosperity. For us as an institution, it's actually not so easy. For no government, because of course we also have our silos, we have our experts. We need to learn to work together to really achieve both of these goals in the same way. And then I think there is actually a very bright future that's ahead of us.
Jörg.
Though we have, and it's very close to what Christian just said, though we have financed almost 400 billion since the beginning of 2020, it's still a niche. And transition finance will bring this from a niche, the environmental and social finance will move via transition finance into the center of a company. And this is a very interesting process because you have to change the whole bank functioning. Eventually we will have to think about that we have to assess 30,000 transition clients eventually, because every of our clients needs to be assessed against a transition framework. What that means in automizing, what that means in the dialogue with the clients, what that means, and transition means, are you ready for the change? Where are your nature services and risks attached to it? That means a deep, deep dialogue. This will change banking, in my view, fundamentally. It will make it much more data-driven, and then hopefully the financings we are doing in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in more difficult countries, we will also be able to automize and assess much, much better, and then scale them up much faster. I think this is, if you ask for us, there are a lot of things outside, but for us internally, that is probably the biggest challenge.
Minister, what is your biggest change?
For me,
it
is the partnerships that need to improve, but let's also talk about accessibility. If we talk about accessibility and inclusivity, I really do believe that we would be able to deal with the challenges that we're facing. But I do believe that we've always been seeing government and private sector and the people as three different sets. We are one. So making sure that from the strategic point of view, from policy formulation as well, let us make sure that we work together, partnerships, but most of all, multilateral institutions are quite important. We know that we have benefited so much from multilateral institutions like the World Bank. So I do believe that that's the only way that we'd be able to move forward. Working together, not working parallel, that's how we're going to be able to deal with the challenges.
So we failed to create a new strategy, but at least we got some new ideas. And thank you very much for the lively discussion. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.